notice for supporters of Always Take Notes. We are overhauling our offering on the crowdfunding site Patreon.
Our central offer for those who support the show is a sheaf of successful journalistic pitches, which we've solicited from friends of Always Take Notes. Now greatly expanded, the package runs to more than 100 pages.
For those who may not know, a pitch is the document, generally sent by email, that lays out the idea for an article. And we've assembled a huge collection of battle-tested examples that all worked in the real world. Every one of them led to an article getting commissioned.
In the package, we now have successful pitches to, among others, The New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Financial Times, The Economist, The London Review of Books, Vanity Fair, Outside Magazine, The Spectator, The Sunday Times, Esquire, Granta, The Literary Review, Bloomberg Businessweek, and GQ.
Anyone who supports the show with $5 a month or more will receive the full compendium.
For those who contribute $10 per month, we'll also add a signed copy of our new podcast book, which is filled with more real-world advice from past guests on Always Take Notes.
Those who pay $15 a month can join a monthly call with Simon and myself to discuss any aspect of their writing lives.
We're keen for the pitch compendium to be a living and constantly growing document. So if any listeners have successful pitches of their own they'd like to include, do get in touch with us through the podcast website. In every case, we redact the editor's name and email address, so no one is breaking confidences by contributing. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself speak with the literary agent Clare Alexander.
We spoke to Clare about the first part of her career as an award-winning editor, about switching to become an agent in the late 1990s, and about working with writers including Pat Barker, Mark Haddon and Sebastian Faulks.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it. Hi Claire, welcome to the podcast. It's excellent to have you on the show. We wanted to start by going back to 1998, so the moment when you changed from being a publisher to an agent. And we saw that you mentioned the role of Pat Barker here. So could you take us back to that time, both in your own career and in the broader publishing landscape, and what was behind that decision for you?
So there were a number of things, and Pat is very relevant. I was quite a successful publisher by any measure. And I had a sort of career where I'd just risen up the publishing industry without very much trouble, actually. And then in 1997, I hit a wall. 1998. Well, anyway, somewhere around there, I hit a wall where some people were brought in over my head. I wasn't going to be demoted. I wasn't going to be fired, but there was no way forward for me. And so that was 97, and I was running Viking. And I moved to Macmillan because they used the magic words editor-in-chief. And I discovered in a year and a half of being an editor-in-chief, I didn't actually like being an editor-in-chief because you have a lot of editors reporting to you and you're further from the writers. Pat had been one of my writers at Penguin, and I had edited the Regeneration trilogy, which had been a high point in my publishing career, and she remained a close friend. Indeed, I had introduced her to Gillan Aitken, who had become her agent, and Pat kept saying, "You two need to work together." And she said that when I left Viking in 97. And she said it louder in 1998 when I left Macmillan, and she wouldn't leave me alone and she wouldn't leave Gillan alone until we spoke to one another. So she actually was the person who said, not only should you be an agent, you should work with Gillan. And then after Gillan's death, I became Pat's agent. So I have been I was her paperback publisher at Penguin when I was the fiction editor at Penguin. I was her editor. I am now her agent. You know, she has been a mainstay of really most of my publishing career and very emotionally important to me and practically important to me.
And can we go even further back now to the start of your career? Were you always interested in books as a youngster?
Yes, very much so. And it was a way that my mother and I sort of spoke to one another. I don't think she did it she had 4 children and I was the third. And I was at boarding school where I wasn't very happy. Whenever I came home for holidays, there would be a pile of books that she would have gathered for me for my holiday reading. And books were always a world into which I could escape. And I loved books. I never thought books could be a livelihood. And it was only later when I answered an ad in the Times that I thought I would get a job as a secretary at Penguin. In those days, we weren't assistants, we were secretaries. And I was interviewed by someone called Jill Norman, who was extremely generous to me. She said, "You're absolutely hopeless. You can't be my secretary. You can hardly type. But they need someone in the rights department." And so she set up that I should go and work in the rights department at Penguin. And I did. And the two women I worked for both were having affairs. This sounds ridiculous, but this is how I made my first steps. They both were having affairs. And I thought the job was dealing with weeping husbands and importuning lovers. And then they both went off with their respective lovers. And I got promoted to run the department, which would never happen now. But the then head of Penguin thought, oh, well, what the hey? And so from the age of about 21 or 22, I was running a department of Penguin. It was just extraordinary.
What we've also heard from people we've had on the podcast who were working in publishing in the 70s was how different a world it is. And, you know, you've alluded to the kind of adultery element, but the other thing that always comes up is this notion that it was pre-big corporate amalgamation, so much smaller firms, a kind of different landscape. Take us back to sort of how it all worked then. And what we always say is you know, no rose-tinted spectacles. So what was good about that environment compared to today, but also what was, you know, suboptimal or different?
Certainly, in the 70s, it was patriarchal, but there were opportunities in the patriarchy for women like me. So most of the publishers who moved forward in that time were young women who were doing rights or publicity. So great publishers like Carmen Khalil or Liz Calder, for example, much older than me, but they started in the publicity departments and got ahead and then moved sideways into editorial. So I moved up the rights ladder and ended up, and then I'll go back to the 60s, but ended up as a director of Hamish Hamilton at the age of 27, which simply couldn't happen now. So, the bad thing was it was very much the bank of mum and dad. It was very middle class. It was completely not diverse. Nobody would have known what diversity meant. And, a book jacket would be that the art director would research, some painting. We'd put some gold type on it. And that was a cover and so it was unbelievably amateur hardback publishing. But because I sold the paperback rights back then, the rights income, and perhaps I should unpack what that means in a minute, but that was actually how those publishers existed, which in fact, as it turned out in my career, was closer to being an agent in a way. My whole career comes together in being an agent. So I remember, for example, being in labour with my first child and my then boss, Christopher Sinclair Stevenson, ringing me up. And instead of saying, I'm in labour, I'm having a baby, he wanted to know what value I put on an Alison Lurie novel for paperback rights. And I answered him. I didn't say, I'm having a baby, get off the phone. And so, the sales were very modest. And we existed, as I say, based on paperback publishing, really. And then later, into the 80s, I crossed over and became a paperback publisher. And I think that's an incredibly important time in my career. And that's not open also to anybody anymore because there's no such thing. But in those days, a paperback publisher needed to have the taste of any editor, but we didn't actually edit. We chose books. The first book I ever bought paperback rights in was Alan Hollinghurst's The Swimming Pool Library, but also a book called Pearls by Celia Brayfield. So now you'd have to be literary or commercial. Then you could be whatever, as long as it was good. And the great publishers of that time were people like Peter Mayer, who ran Penguin, and Sonny Mehta, who in those days ran Pan and started Picador. And they were as happy publishing the winner of a Booker as the F-Plan diet, in Peter's case. So you grew up with it, around knowing what excellence was, but also not being embarrassed by success. And so the 80s was much more open. There were many more young, interesting people because it was the important time of the paperback publishers, which was much more egalitarian, I would say, than the hardback publishers. And then I was lucky enough to become a hardback publisher in the 90s, which was when Waterstones was growing. So there were all these bookshop chains opening, and it was the time of the first, for example, the first and most significant, actually, Granta Best of Young British. And there were, publishing was growing, and there were all these wonderful young writers, and it was all very exciting. And you almost couldn't fail, provided you knew something about good literature. By the time I left publishing, and I know I haven't stuck at all to your question, but by the time I left publishing, it was becoming much more corporate. And even though by then I was in charge of various publishing imprints, all decisions were made, by a sort of sales, marketing, editorial was a voice and perhaps a leading voice, but not the voice anymore. And I'd been so spoilt, I'd been able, really, I realised, going back to Pat Barker, I would never have got to publish The Ghost Road, which won the Booker Prize, because her previous novels, while well received, had not sold very well. And so it became very, very much more about track record and, sales estimates. And while I don't decry that, in my day, as long as the entire imprint made money, nobody questioned the individual choices. And then every book became that every book had to be profitable. And that was sort of the beginning of the end for me. So I'm back to a world where as long as in the whole, in the round, we're successful, no one says to me, why are you representing that author who doesn't make any money? And very often in my experience, they do, but not yet.
There's a lot to unpack there, but just to follow up on something you said in the beginning of the answer, you mentioned the kind of market difference in the 80s between paperbacks and hardbacks. Could you unpack that a little bit and then maybe talk about how it works now in terms of which is the kind of main engine of profit, so to speak?
So in the 80s, paperback publishers were not in the same groups as the hardback publishers. So the hardback publishers were small, usually largely independent entities, and the paperback houses were bigger and richer. And they would almost use the hardback as test marketing, and they'd come along and say, I think that author's going to be successful in paperback, I will give you £100,000. The author gets that, but, they would offer to buy the paperback rights in books that they thought would be successful. And that was the 70s. Then the paperback houses in the 80s realised this was a very expensive way of being. So they began acquiring hardback publishers. So in the 70s, in the 80s, forgive me, I had been the rights director of Hamish Hamilton. And then Penguin bought Hamish Hamilton so that they had access to all of Hamish Hamilton's books rather than having to have bidding wars to get their rights. People think, by the way, that publishing has got more brutal. If I tell you that when Penguin bought Hamish Hamilton, I was the only member of staff who survived at Penguin after the takeover, it was just as brutal, if not more brutal. And I survived by crossing over and becoming a paperback editor myself.
Another thing that we came to mind while researching your publishing career was your record of spotting debuts who went on to become very big names. So Alex Garland, Haruki Murakami, Donna Tartt. How does that work in for those specific examples? But then in general with a debut, what are you looking for?
I think it's a mixture of gut and brain. You can't get away from the fact that it's something that moves you. And so I think I have always had taste, and I've honed that taste probably through experience. But very often those first books weren't successful. I mean, The Beach was very successful, and The Secret History was very successful. Helen Dunmore was very successful. But for example, Haruki Murakami, I did publish his first novel, and it was extremely unsuccessful. And it was several books later before he was successful. I published the first Amitav Ghosh, very unsuccessful. It was several books later where he broke out. So it's not that I was always right. I certainly wasn't always right. But I was right quite often, but not always with the book, not always with the debut. So I actually get irked at the moment by the emphasis only on debuts. It's because debuts have no track record, and most track record is bad. So publishers somehow convince themselves that every debut is going to change the nature of the world. There are a couple of debuts a year that work, but only a couple. And publishers publish masses of them. But so debuts are, it's very exciting to find a new voice. I think I'm always looking for something different, and that's part of it. So, you know, The Beach, for example, was a big epic story told in short chapters. It was really a Robert Louis Stevenson done modern with a touch of Conrad, but it felt very fresh. And also I was aware, so it wasn't just gut, I was aware that kids were all going to Thailand. So there was a sort of ready market out there. But when I bought The Beach, and Alex was, I think, 26 or 27, no, one other publisher bid on that book. It was auctioned, and the only other publisher who wanted it was Constable, who at that time were a very old-fashioned, rather slow publishing house, now quite different, belonging, of course, to one of the big groups. But, you know, it was gut and brain. I loved it. I found it thrilling, but I also knew that there were lots of kids who went to Thailand for whom that book might be meaningful.
There's a lot of talk these days about kind of acquisitions meetings where editors have to sort of justify why they want to take something on. Was that something that existed when you were acquiring those books?
Yes, it did exist. And at Penguin, the then editor-in-chief, who I adored, was someone called Peter Carson, who was incredibly clever. He actually bought the first Zadie Smith, for example, on 27 pages. But Peter spoke fluent Russian, Greek, Latin. I mean, I am so uneducated in comparison with Peter. And he wouldn't have anybody in the meeting except editors. So it was a quite different time. And he would sit like Caesar at the top of the table, and you'd pitch something, and he'd basically give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. He'd do a sum on the back of an envelope, and he'd say, OK, you can buy that. Don't pay more than £30,000, you know. So it was still amateur, probably, as publishing had been in the 70s, but it was in the hands of very brainy people. And when I look back at the group of people who were around that table at Penguin in those days, it was an extraordinary, talented bunch of people who are still my friends.
Could you tell us about 1995 now? So this was the year that you won, you were the editor of the winners of the Booker Prize, the Orange Prize, and the Whitbread. What was that like as an experience? We've had various Booker Prize winners on the authors who've told us how fascinating, but also kind of how strange an experience it is. And we've also had the lady who runs One World who won a different sort of triple in successive years. But what was that experience like for you?
Well, it's a funny story in a way, because Simon Prosser has subsequently done the same, who now runs Hamish Hamilton. And when Simon did it, Penguin by now, is very conscious of corporate PR. And Simon, quite rightly, was praised to the skies. Actually, I don't think anybody but me noticed that I'd edited the 3 winners, and certainly nobody talked about it. And I wasn't to get big-headed. It was still absolutely wonderful. And there were some funny things. So Helen Dunmore, who I'd edited, won the inaugural Women's Prize. And I had been on the board of the Women's Prize. I'm not sure I was there. I think I went on after that, actually. But I was one of the women who'd started the Women's Prize. And Cherie Blair was there. And she didn't know anybody. And I know her very slightly because I live in Islington. So she, I think I don't know how the dates work and whether or not Tony had become Prime Minister, but she was certainly in the room and she was sort of standing with Helen and me because she didn't know anybody else. And then Helen was announced as the winner. So she was sort of part of that moment. It became a sort of new Labour moment. And that was absolutely thrilling. And Pat winning the Booker, well, I've talked about what Pat means to me. And but also that night there was a bet. So her agent, as I've mentioned, had become Gillan Aitken. And we were talking about Pat's next book. And he wanted me to spend more money than Penguin or I wanted to spend. So we had a bet that if she won the Booker, I would increase the advance. I can't remember by how much. And of course, she did win. And we weren't at all sorry to do the deal that he wanted after that. And that was a thrilling night. William Trevor was the one who won the Whitbread. And I take little credit for that, although I loved him. He delivered the most perfect manuscripts. I never changed a word. I never suggested anything. You just pass it straight to production, more or less. So being his editor really was a case of sort of talking to him about what he wanted on the cover. But those were the 3, and they're both wonderful writers, and I'm grateful to have been part of their lives, and those were wonderful moments. But as I say, it wasn't, publishers didn't really make much of the publisher at that time.
I can almost hear writers sort of screaming in envy at the prospect of a perfect manuscript. But did it change things for you in terms of authors wanting to work with you? Or, as you say, was there just not this recognition or discussion of your kind of talent in spotting people and nurturing them?
I don't think it changed things for me. And that thing I've mentioned, which I uploaded really from being a paperback publisher, of publishing great range, combined, I think, with a sort of sexism. I think at the time, there were people who regarded me as a bit of a vulgarian because I also published commercial fiction and enjoyed it. Nobody ever thought that Peter Mayer or Sonny Mehta were vulgarians, but I think there was a sort of sense that you were a bit tainted. And I dwell on it now because I realise what a hat trick it was. But at the time, I honestly don't think I dwelt on it very much. And I certainly didn't want to sort of be put down as a show-off.
We previously had Kate Moss on the podcast, and she told us about her role with the Women's Prize. But we saw that you were part of that story as well. So could you tell us about that element of your career?
Yes. And I love Kate. And it all goes back to, which I'm sure she said, when there were no women on the Booker shortlist, and it was the year of Angela Carter. And there were a group of us who were angry women, and anger can lead to a lot of very positive things. And we all met in the flat of somebody called Anne McDermott, who was an agent. And we decided to start a prize. And Kate and Jane Gregory offered themselves to do all the heavy lifting. So at the end of that, I think we were all a bit drunk, frankly. But anyway, off went Jane and Kate to try and raise the money for a prize. And going back to this repeated theme about the amateurishness of publishing at that time, the start of the Women's Prize, we were incredibly amateurish. And I was quite quickly on the original board. and we used to just meet for dinner and gossip and decide who the judges would be. And of course, it has become this extraordinary, very professional and brilliant operation. But it began in a sort of drunken rage of a group of women.
What did being on the board involve?
Well, it was a few meetings a year, and we would talk about, what we were going to do that year, and mostly choosing judges and raising money. And there was a year which was the hardest year, quite late on, when Orange, because it was the Orange Prize, and they had been very, very generous and good sponsors, and they dropped out, and we didn't have anybody else. So we actually literally had to go out with a begging bowl and raise money. That was a tough year. And we went round to anybody we could think of with any money and asked for money. And we did manage to run the prize for that year. And then new sponsorship was found by the following year. But we had 1 year without. So it was sort of doing whatever you had to do. From lifting up the phone and asking people with a bit of money if they'd pay it, or thinking about who would make a good judge or whatever.
This is not a question about the prize, but on that amateurism question more generally, were the Americans amateur at that time? Or was their culture already very different?
No, that's a very interesting question. I don't think they were as amateur as we. And I think it's a sort of English, or it was. I don't know if it is anymore, but sort of, being quite proud. It's sort of like village cricket. I don't know. Being quite proud of sort of not being very professional. Corporate publishing really started in America, and they were much, much more professional. It's a very interesting question. I haven't really thought about it. I have always loved working with American editors, and actually in a certain way found myself sometimes more at home with American editors and British editors. And maybe less so now, but certainly in my early career. And I think that was something to do with the marrying together the notion of excellence with the idea of commerce, and not being embarrassed by the notion of commerce. And I think that's a very American thing. They value success, and they think hard about how to get it. And they put a lot of energy into it too. They were more professional.
And then to return to the question that we opened with in terms of your move from publishing to agenting, you've described it as a great escape. Why did you couch it in those terms precisely?
I think because publishing was becoming more corporate. And I used to think I was quite good at working for anybody. But in fact, I now realise that I could be horribly disdainful. And it was very obvious to whoever I was working for if I didn't respect them. So the great thing about being an agent is that it enabled me in a certain way to recapture the things I'd loved about my job in the 80s and 90s, because it's the opposite of corporate. Good agents are cats who walk alone. At Aitken Alexander, I like them to be cats who can be friendly with other cats, but effectively you have your own client list and nobody tells you no. So if I liked a writer called Mark Haddon, nobody else had to read it. And indeed, Mark Haddon's first book I couldn't sell. And then his second book was The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. So, I could be playful. And I could back my own judgment, and I'm allowed to be wrong. But as long as I'm right often enough, you live on commission and you can live quite well.
We wanted to come back to Mark Haddon in a moment, but just on that 90s switch, we saw also that you were involved in the Chris Patton imbroglio. Is that right? What was your... we saw that the coverage said that you rescued him, in fact.
Well, that was. I sometimes say I'm a bit witchy. I am a bit witchy because you have to sort of be, if you're trying to think about what's going to happen in the future, what book people might want to read. So Chris Patton's agent was someone called Michael Sissons, and Michael auctioned his book. And we lost. At that point, I was editor-in-chief of Macmillan, and it was won by HarperCollins. Normally, when you lose an auction, you just go away and lick your wounds. You move on to the next thing. For some reason, I wrote an email to Michael at that point and said, I'm sorry we didn't win, but if anything ever goes wrong, you'll know where to find me. Now, why did I've never done that in my life, if anything goes wrong. Well, something went very, very wrong. And they couldn't afford to go out to the market because it was all being kept sub rosa. So there was this letter in the days where there were files, in the letter saying if anything goes wrong from Clare Alexander. So they called me up and said, it's gone wrong. Would you publish Chris Patton? And I said yes. So Macmillan did publish it, but it was a mixed blessing. I mean, I did rescue him in a way, but I don't think I won friends at Macmillan for getting it. You know, it was a very masculine company, very masculine hierarchy. And again, you know, my head was too much above the parapet. So I actually think that was the beginning of the end of my career at Macmillan. Although, you know, we rescued Chris.
You make it sound a little bit as if the kind of the patriarchal, you know, atmosphere or whatever that you mentioned earlier in your career kind of persisted until that point. Is that fair?
Yes. In some publishers. I actually don't think Penguin was patriarchal. It was, but, you know, it was actually very egalitarian. And I think I had the nicest office in the building. When I went to Macmillan, although I had a very senior job, when I went to see the man who ran the whole thing, I nearly landed flat on my face because the carpet pile into his office had gone up because he had to have a better carpet because he was the boss. There's no question that Peter Mayer had the same stained carpet as the rest of us. So there were companies that were more hierarchical than others, and I guess I've never been great with hierarchies. As an agent, you don't sort of have to be.
As long-time listeners of the show will know, we published Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, in 2023. We're pleased to say that we have now put together a new and updated edition of the book, which now features contributions from more than 100 past guests on the podcast.
The book, which is available now, is the distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 7 years. It offers frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Alongside all the great guests we quoted in the first edition, the update includes new material from Harlan Coben, Victoria Hislop, Lee Child, Megan Nolan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Philippa Gregory, Joe Nesbo, Paul Theroux, Hisham Matar, and Bethany Hughes.
Published by Ithaca Press, the latest edition of Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, is available from all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it.
Turning to your agenting career now and to your long-standing partner Gillen Aitken, we found this lovely description of him, which was from one of the testimonials, saying, when I first met him 25 years ago, he was standing at the bar of a restaurant at lunchtime, drinking a Negroni and smoking a Players. The word patrician could have been invented for him, tall and straight as a telegraph pole. Could you tell us about his background, which, you know, we saw he did intelligence work and all sorts of things, and then how you ended up working with him?
So he was extremely tall, and in fact, I think he was 6'6", and there was a thing that he didn't want anyone at the office ever to be taller than him. We did hire someone who was taller than him, and we always lied and said that they were not taller than him. He had a fantastic head of hair, and still sometimes, although he's been dead since 2016, I'll spot his hair. You know, I'll see somebody and think, oh, that's Gillen's hair. And he smoked constantly. And when, offices had to have smoke alarms, we illegally took the smoke alarm out of his office because he couldn't stop. And of course, he died of, well, in his case, mouth and throat cancer. He smoked untipped, I can't remember what the make was, but it was they were certainly untipped cigarettes. And he didn't have a notebook. He didn't really have a phone. He made notes inside his cigarette packet. Tiny little writing. This huge man would write these tiny little notes inside his cigarette packet. He had been in intelligence. And I represent an American thriller writer just for the UK. And he had a background in the CIA. And I remember introducing them to each other, and they began to speak in a way I had no idea what they were on about. And it got down to the CIA persons who saying, well, I'll always have Moscow. And Gillen saying, well, I'll always have Berlin. So I never knew how. My own belief actually is that Gillen probably decoded, he spoke fluent Russian. And I think he probably translated things. But he liked the aura of mystery. He would have been a disaster to send into anything because he was so recognizable. So, he could never have gone undercover. This huge, elegant man would be completely recognizable. Ironically, my boss, who I've already mentioned at Penguin, Peter Carson, had also worked in some way during the Cold War. And I married a South American, so I won't say, I need to go home to a South American, but I need to go to the office to these rather sort of cool, complicated ex-spies. Because they both were.
The notes inside the cigarette packet, does feel very, very spy-like.
He was a neat freak, and I'm not very tidy. And in those days, we had paper manuscripts. And so the sound of working with Gillen was this sort of tapping, because he'd be tapping the manuscript on his desk to make it absolutely square. He couldn't bear it if any of the pieces of paper were sticking out in any way.
Fair enough. Once you'd made your Great Escape, how did you go about building your list and finding authors to represent?
I was terrified. I honestly didn't know where authors would come from. And I also thought maybe authors would follow me. And then I realized, that a lot of my friends were these authors' agents, and there are agents who've made careers out of stealing other people's clients, but that didn't feel like what I wanted to do. And so, because I hadn't been too bad a person, it turned out it was recommendation. So almost all the clients I have, not all, a few come out of unsolicited, but a tiny percentage. Mostly other authors say, you need Clare, or go to Clare. And that's gone on all through my career, which is now more than 25 years of being an agent. So I think the publishing career didn't seamlessly result in all the authors I'd edited becoming my clients, but those people sent me other people. And that worked very well for me. And it worked quite fast. The other thing perhaps to say is that when I started, because fiction, really I'm a fiction person at base, but it takes longer to work with a novelist. You need an entire novel. You might need to work with them on a draft or two. Non-fiction you can sell on a proposal. And I find it quite quick to work with non-fiction people, just honing a proposal. So in my first year, I covered the costs, really, by selling mainly history proposals. And then by the second year, fiction I'd been quietly working on, I could bring to the market. Some of those historians are no longer my clients, because actually what I discovered is that not every academic historian can write for a general reader. But it helped me sort of get started.
Can we come back to Mark Haddon now? So we've also had him as a guest on the show, and I think he told a story about being in a taxi with you as an auction kind of went completely ballistic. I was wondering if you could tell us, I think he also told, I mean, it's a very funny interview. It's a while ago we did it. He talked, I think, about writing the intro for 3 novels and giving them to his wife, Sos Eltis. And one of them was The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. But really it being a bit of a, not nadir, but, he was not, he was struggling in some ways. So tell us about, how you guys came together and how that worked out.
So Mark is a very good example of this. Mark had an agent, and he was quite successful as an author for children. And Mark is, every single client is different. Every person is different. And one of the things I learn is what each author needs from me. Mark needs a new challenge every time. So his then agent, he wanted to write a book for adults, and she said, why would you do that? You make a perfectly good living. Why would you want to do anything else? And I don't think Mark would mind me saying he had a breakdown. He needed to be allowed to follow his star, and his agent was sort of preventing him. So somebody who knew both of us said, go to Clare. And he came to me with a novel I liked, which is in a drawer and will remain forever in a drawer. I couldn't sell it at all. And so he'd got an agent and I couldn't deliver. But I thought he had talent. And of course he does. But as I was saying, not every debut works. Then I didn't know that story about Sos. But the next book was The Curious Incident. And it remains probably the most successful book I've ever represented. And it took off almost immediately in a most extraordinary way. Mark and I were indeed, he'll have a different memory of it than me, but we certainly were going around London seeing different publishers by taxi. And we also had my dog with us, my then dog Arnie, which is quite funny given that the book starts with this dead dog. And we appeared for all these interviews with this rather poorly behaved Bichon Frise. And we were just having fun. But what was happening was, as we were going, I was getting calls from our rights director saying, the Dutch publisher offers X, the Swedish publisher offers Y, the Germans want that. I mean, it was literally happening as we were selling the British rights, that for some reason, because it wasn't like everything else, this is a sort of a returning thing about what interests me. Not following, I can't be interested in genre. Mark was doing something quite unusual that even to this day, I don't think gets its full recognition. And maybe we can go back to Mark's other books in a bit. But that book just grabbed everybody. And it's still an enormous bestseller and a loved book. And it also, Mark had the grace to stand back when we sold the theatre, when the theatre rights were sold. He had a say in who should adapt it, but he let Simon Stephens do what he wanted to do. He didn't interfere. And so the book had this other extraordinary life on the stage. But it did start it literally started as we were rushing around London with a small dog, going to see publishers to decide who was going to be his publisher.
I wonder if it seemed like part of the sort of publicity for the book.
The funniest thing like that ever happened in my career was when I was, which we haven't touched on, I worked for a period after Penguin and before going back to Penguin and Hamish Hamilton. I worked for an academic publisher called Routledge and Keegan Paul. And the head of Routledge and Keegan, I was meant to be doing rights and contracts, but he let us do pretty well anything. And so David Godwin, now an agent, who was the psychology editor, and I did a book called The Book of Heroic Failures, which was an enormous bestseller in its day. And when we sent what was called camera-ready copy to America, which is so that they could reproduce the book, very difficult to sell in America. America doesn't find the idea of failure funny. But we found one publisher who wanted to do it, and in transit, they lost page 1. So the book started on page 2, and they had to have a 1-page erratum slip. And I can't remember where, let's say it was the New York Times. But anyway, someone said it was this most brilliant marketing device, but it actually was an accident. So, things turn out in strange ways.
That's an excellent story. Jumping to the present now, I mean, how many clients do you have on your roster, and what's the rough split between non-fiction and fiction?
So I never count my number of clients because I think I'll have a nervous breakdown if I actually confront how many people I represent. It probably is 100, and it may be more than 100. It's probably 2/3 fiction, or maybe something like that. It's more fiction than non-fiction. In non-fiction, I err towards narrative and writing, which are the same things I look for in fiction. So I say on our website, I'm not interested in any how-to or well-being or, anyway, I'm allergic to all that stuff. It makes me cringe. But for example, I represent Rory Stewart. Now, I took on Rory when he was in his 20s, and he walked across Asia, and he'd written some pieces in the LRB. And I just thought he was a great writer. I had no idea he'd go into politics. There was no such thing as podcasts. So again, you don't know what the future holds, but I did know he had talent, and he does.
We should say also that we've had Rory Stewart on the podcast as well, so you can go and listen to him. Also, relatively recently, we saw that you spoke to a parliamentary committee on this issue of cancel culture and censorship in publishing, and you talked about this generational divide. I mean, that was, I think, 2021, but how do you see that, and have things changed since then?
It's a very fraught subject, and I'm not sure what I can or should say about it. At the risk of getting in trouble, I do think there is a generational divide. I think there's an older generation who are omni-curious. I certainly think I am. And I am as interested in what somebody has to say in their 20s as somebody in their 80s. But I don't think that's true of the 20 or 30 somethings. And I think that the mirror they hold up, or that maybe that's not the right image, but the what they're looking for is so narrowly focused on themselves. And that's the opposite of that paperback culture I grew up in that I was talking about, where you had to, on the one, where you didn't boast, where you looked out for things you thought were excellent, and then you brought your commercial brain to bear on that thing. But you didn't think me. And so it makes me sad, actually, because I find that there are quite a lot of younger people in publishing who struggle and who feel like so many things are there to hurt them, rather than to think about ways in which they can bring joy and information to the world. So there's some, maybe I shouldn't even say that. I don't know. But I still see a generational divide. It's not everywhere. It's not ubiquitous. But there's some of that about.
Well, publishing's reluctance or otherwise to engage in controversial matters of debate is, again, a kind of theme of the podcast. But it's also a rule of the podcast that we talk about money, which is another subject that comes up and people don't want to talk about. So could you kind of explain to listeners who might not be aware how agents make it work, how they make their living, and how it's worked for you over the course of your career as well?
Okay. In a certain way, being an agent should be quite a pure relationship with the author, in the sense that you should live on commission. And the standard commission for an agent is 15%, with 20% on certain things that are a bit more expensive to do, like translation rights. But it's between 15 and 20%. And that means that the agent makes no money unless the author makes money. And if I choose to spend time on a book I may or may not sell, I may make no money. And as I said earlier, I think it's worth failing sometimes. So it's by no means true that everything I do succeeds, but you need enough 15 or 20% to live. And I have been lucky. It's not just luck, it's also judgment, but you can make quite a good living on 15 or 20%. However, what is happening now is there are masses of there are big corporate agencies, and then there are lots of little startups. And some of them are calling them management companies. And once you become a management company, you charge. So we charge for nothing at all. And most traditional agents, you might, even now, we don't actually make photocopies, so there's almost no charges. We don't actually use post. There used to be some small deductions for expenses. There's almost nothing you can say, since all transactions are on the screen. We're not charging authors really anything. But a management company will charge. And I'm not very comfortable with that. I think it messes up the potential purity of the relationship between the author and agent. It is fair to say it isn't 100% pure, in the sense that an agent might take the view that they want as many 15 or 20% as they can, and therefore that their advice to an author might be driven by their own profit. So I'm not saying it's absolutely pure. I would like to say about myself and our agency that we are about careers and not just individual books. And because I've been around for a long time, what can happen quite easily in the book market as it is you can sell a debut for a great deal of money, it fails, and then the author is ruined. Very, very hard to bring them back. And publishers are wont to say, the book failed, the author failed. They don't say, I failed. And as I said earlier, most debuts actually don't work. A couple do. And the ones that do go on. But, there is a danger that some agents won't take a long-term view. But other than that, I'd say it should be quite a sort of straightforward relationship that isn't monetized unless you're both successful.
On that relationship point, one thing we hear often from kind of young aspirant writers who are just starting out is that they'll make contact with an agent or they'll be represented, but then they find that they're not necessarily getting much of that person's time, that some of the communication isn't responded to and things like that. And as you said, obviously, it's tricky because the agent is paid on commission and these people are junior and stuff like that. And again, this is no aspersion on how you do things, but in the industry at large, if you are a young person being represented at the beginning of your career and you feel that you're not getting emails back or stuff like that, what do you advise?
Look for another agent, and it's scary. People look for agents at the beginning of a career for obvious reasons. They're advised to do that, and they should do that. But it's not the end of the road. It should be the beginning of something. And if that agent isn't putting, the real role, the most important role, other than the taste question at the beginning, so that the publisher knows that if something comes from that agent, it's worth their taking their time. But you have to know that they're also actually advocating for you. And advocacy is the most important part of being an agent. If that agent isn't replying to your phone calls, you have to move on. And it's extremely complicated, and you have to say, I'm sorry, but this isn't working for me. You really ought to leave the agent before you approach another agent. In real life, sometimes people sound other people out. But if they're not doing anything and they've just sort of put you in their list but not actually working, you have to move on. You being the author. Yeah.
There you go. Straightforward. We're coming towards the end of our time, so I wanted to ask about My Sister the Serial Killer, which I've read and really enjoyed. Tell us a little bit about how you came to represent that author and that book, and then at what point you kind of sensed it was going to become this big hit.
That is another good story. So when Gillen died, my business partner died, and it was a sad time. And this manuscript came, and probably about this time of year when I was weary, as I'm weary now, and I was sad, and I thought, I'm not going to read any work, but it was quite short. And at that point, I think it was called Next of Kin. And I read it and it made me laugh. This sort of hollow, dark laughter. And I thought, well, if it makes me laugh now, it's going to make other people laugh. So, and it reminded me of an Almodovar movie. So two things happened. One is I came up with an Almodovar type of title. So I suggested we call it My Sister the Serial Killer, and Oyen loved it. And we worked together to make it longer, which is very unusual. I mean, whatever the author needs is what you have to do. And it was too short. And so I'd say, describe the hospital. You know, what does the doctor look like? You know, where is the ward or whatever? And she would write more in and more in. The honest truth is that's sort of the opposite of Mark Haddon's story. A lot of people turned it down. I keep a note of what everyone says, not so I can say, you said this, but so I know, how people are responding. I just keep, the sort of central part of their rejection, say. And most publishers rejected My Sister the Serial Killer. Very same editors who later write to me and say it was their favourite book, they want a quote, they love it. And I sort of think, no, you didn't. But it doesn't really matter. The point. So it didn't take off immediately. And James Roxburgh at Atlantic loved it. And he got it in the same way as way back when I was a publisher, I got The Beach and nobody else did. James got Oyen. And so he actually talked to his ex-boss about how to take it off the market and how to talk to me, and he came to me with an offer. And we did a deal. It never went, it wasn't an auction, actually. And then things began from there, and, the buzz began. But initially, I think a lot of people, there are now a lot, in fact, at the Frankfurt Book Fair this year, there were 4 books described as being like My Sister the Serial Killer. But at the time, it was an outlier and nobody got it, really. She's now delivered her second novel, which will be published next year, and she's grown as a writer, and it's even better. So watch out for Cursed Daughters. She's amazing. But it really started just because I was in a dark place, and it made me laugh.
Well, look, so Claire, thank you for an absolutely fascinating and wide-ranging conversation, particularly on a dark and cold winter afternoon, and wishing you all the best with your numerous projects going forward.
Thank you so very much.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Clare Alexander. She's not on social media, but you can read more about her work at aitkenalexander.co.uk. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Clare?
What I thought was extraordinary about it was really kind of 50 years of publishing history, really. I mean, she began her career in the early 1970s, and it was just sweeping, right? Like the kind of cultural changes. I thought the stuff about the kind of increasing professionalism of British publishing and the role of the Americans was fascinating. I also thought this kind of central hinge point that she had in the early 1990s, where she went from editor to publisher, was fascinating. But yeah, I mean, just interactions with hugely famous and significant writers along the way. I also quite liked the bit where she described herself as witchy. I thought that was fun. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, it was a hilarious assemblage of stories. The affairs that led to her promotion, Aitken not wanting anyone to be taller than him, and removing smoke alarms so that he could smoke in the office. And I particularly enjoyed the story of the kind of gladiatorial acquisitions meetings, getting a thumbs up or a thumbs down from the boss. And in general, I think that description of assessing writing and writers as a mixture of gut and brain is very apt. Anyway, a great interview. What have you been up to, Simon?
I was just going to add to that, actually. I thought the other thing that was very interesting is when we pushed at the end as to, what you should do if you're a young writer and your supposed agent is not answering your emails. And she was actually very clear on that, right? Like you have to move on. So that was interesting. As I was saying off air, I have just submitted my book. So we're recording this on Woo.
That was such a half-hearted woo.
I know, but Rachel, I'm a broken man, so that's all the wooing that's capable. We are recording this on the 1st of January, and I submitted it yesterday on the 31st. So it was both on time and pretty much on length, which is an unforeseen. All my editors will be going like, "That's very unlike Simon." Yeah, it feels quite strange and quite weird. I'm pretty tired, and I would really like to have some time off, and I can't because I've got a few other bits and bobs of work lined up, but that's okay. So I've heard back from my editors, and now they'll get back to me at the end of the month. But yeah, it's It's obviously not finished, it's a first draft and all that kind of thing, but it feels kind of reasonably significant. And I have been, in terms of matters cultural, I have been reading a book on the collapse of Bear Stearns from 2009 because I'm fact-checking my friend's novel that has some stuff in about that. Anyway, what about you, Rachel? What have you been up to and what have you been consuming?
I had a lovely Christmas break, which seemed to go by very quickly, as it always does. There's lots of catching up with family and watching lots of television, things like the Gavin and Stacey finale and the new Wallace and Gromit film, which was excellent, as well as some odd...
Yeah, I saw a bit of that as well.
It's very good. The kind of song of the garden gnome robot has been in my head ever since.
Also, the sort of subtle literary references I thought were quite fun.
Virginia
as well.
Woolf. Yeah, very good. So kind of now back to work for a little bit, but yes, the usual Christmas kind of languor, I would say.
Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Aitken.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.